Good afternoon, post-lunch, first session. My name is William Tulloch, or Bill Tulloch. I use both. I also respond to hey you, just in case you're wondering. I have recently become a principal software engineer at Microsoft, and previously I was a principal consultant at Telstra Purple. I have a confession to make. I made a mistake. When I first put this talk in and proposed it, I was thinking, I'm just going to do a slightly more reasoned, less sweary version of a talk I did last year called I Hate Web Development. And there is truth in that as well. Yeah, this is going to be really easy. And if you want to keep a swear counter going, please someone keep count, because it's going to happen sooner or later. But then, and here's the thing, when we're working on stuff, when we're in the heart of the engine, we're not really paying attention to what's going on outside. You know, maybe a Twitter thing you see, oh, someone's talking about a new framework. Or, you know, you're watching TV and browsing Facebook, though I don't get anything about technology in Facebook. So I stepped out and I said, right, I'll start doing my research. There's a couple of things I'd heard about server-side rendering. I thought, that's curious. And then I went down the rabbit hole. I have spent 2 months reading articles upon article upon article. I've had 100 tabs open at any one time in my browser. My reality fragmented and unraveled and mutated. I had lost sight of where the world was. My certainty about what I was doing was on a precipice. And that's the talk I'm going to give you today, because all of that goes to what this is about. In what we are going to cover, very loosely and with different degrees of ranting, is a bit about the history, and I'll explain in a second. We're going to look at some of the things that are coming up, that are surfacing on the web and in blog posts and stuff about the state of web development. And then I'm probably going to round it out with my thoughts on where we're at and what we should be doing. I'm happy for interjections. If you really want to ask a question, please feel free. So, you may ask yourself, how did we get here? We've been doing web development for close on 25 to 30 years in one form or another. It is not a new tech stack anymore. It's older than .NET, which is my preferred place of residence. And part of what I'm seeing is that I think we're not remembering our history either. So as part of this talk, I'm going to give you a quick context, because it is worthwhile knowing how we got to where we are now, as well as knowing what's happening now, because they actually influence each other. So this is a very poorly written out timeline. It is neither accurate in scale or dates, but it will do. And that little yellow dot is when I started working in web development. So I have unfortunately been the victim of my own madness and have been doing this for a long time. But there are some key things here. 1990 to 1995, really this is, you know, from the moment we kind of started thinking about HTML. In that period, the proposal for CSS was put forward, JavaScript was invented. That all happened in that period. I'm not going to go over that. It's kind of, you can look it up, much easier. 1996 to 1999, whereas when things really started happening, standardization was a thing that we were finally actually trying to consider. But browser compliance was shite, number one, and the browser wars ignited. At that point, what did a browser war consist of? Microsoft developing IE and Netscape. And it went on. And as a developer, this was incredibly frustrating. Even though we had sweet FA in terms of CSS styling and stuff, it still caused problems when we were trying to develop applications. Microsoft, being the sneaky people that I'm just checking for ninjas, because I'm making comments about my organization now, got around this by saying, right, we're going to stick IE on every operating system. And they surprisingly won temporarily the browser war for a period of time. Netscape kind of dribbled off, Mozilla came up, and then it went on. But the browser wars are a bit like the 100-Year War in Europe. It wasn't a continuous fight, and it wasn't a continuous war. It was a lot of series of skirmishes. And as the developers, we were the the victims of this. It was our villages they came and burnt down when they were having a bit of a spat, right? And even within one type of browser, so IE is a classic example, on Windows it did one thing, on the Mac it did another. So I worked at a travel group and travel agents were using Macs and weird stuff was happening. It was totally inverting all the colors. No idea. So I literally spent one day running 2.5 blocks from Swanson Street up Exhibition Street to a friend's art design school because they had Macs. And I never fixed it. So we were always caught out by the lack of standards and the inability of these 2 or 3 or 4 people to actually agree on anything. 2000 to 2006, I did have to update the other day. We started seeing CSS frameworks coming through. They weren't that predominant. The big one is the jQuery came about. Now, why did we get jQuery? jQuery, we forget that it was the first library that made working with JavaScript and interacting with the DOM easier. It actually took out a lot of boilerplate code for us. And it was a good thing then. And this is, again, and it helped us with the performance of our code. So jQuery became a thing at that point. Also, front-end package management. We started seeing things for managing packages whose names I can't remember anymore because it was that long ago. The other one I missed, which is up the top, 96 Flash. And I'll pivot back to that. And I also worked with that. So what a lot of us forget is trying to do any decent design work in HTML was a shit fight. You know, does anyone ever remember the one GIF spacer? Yeah, so yeah, we created 1 pixel spaces so we could actually take a design that a designer did in Photoshop, the lovely dears, chop it up and either use GIF spaces or tables to lay it out. Both totally inappropriate, but that's what we did. So when Flash came along, it gave designers actually a much better palette to work with, and it gave us a way of actually saying, hey, we can actually make this look like a real application. During the Flash era, the one thing I do remember was, has anyone seen Escape from LA? One person. I am talking to a younger audience. And when that came out, that was the sequel to Escape from New York. The big thing was they built a game in Flash with our hero, Snake Plissken, playing basketball. And it was a big hit. It was great. And so Flash was going really well. But it was a lot more for websites. You wouldn't build an application with it. 2007, the release of the iPhone. Now, this is critical. And we'll come back to why that is critical. Coincidentally, same year, Microsoft released Silverlight. And again, we suddenly had a way where we could build business applications without the constraints that HTML was imposing on us. So we could, it was based on XAML, so we could take stuff we'd done in WPF, because that was also pretty hip at the time, and we could build real-world business applications. We could have proper tables. We could do stuff. We could send WCF messages. And if anyone remembers that, you're unfortunate. But the iPhone release. This has probably the largest impact on where we are in terms of web development. Because what it did is it suddenly put the world in everyone's pocket. Prior to this, when we were building web applications, say, well, a monitor, 640 by 480, bang, that's it. Cool, I can just do that. You actually have to cable. You've got to be plugged in. You can't use it otherwise. The iPhone suddenly said, well, I can be anywhere. And I still want to get to my web pages, or my web application. And that's when things really started changing. Key things that have come out of that, concepts like responsive design, mobile first, but probably the real big one was single-page applications. So why did the phone have that impact? Because we suddenly started realizing that a full-bodied web application that was reloading every page, every time you navigated on another link or to another menu item was too heavy. This is 3G period, so the amount of load that required was too great. So then the ideas come out and say, well, hey, what we should do so that they have a sense that something's happening is we load a shell. So an HTML page loads a little bit of JavaScript, comes up, and then we can push other stuff up. What we also did is we started working with APIs, and in the sense of calling a back end and just getting some data in. We weren't having to call the back to the server and pull the whole page up. We could just say, hey, give me this data. I'm going to come in here and I'll display it. And that way, we saw things like Backbone, Ember, AngularJS start coming to the front. And that is the birth of rock and roll and single-page applications. And it was great. You know, most of those early libraries were based on the model view star pattern, but it worked. We were actually now able to create dynamic views. We were able to control the amount of data was coming in. We were improving the performance of the applications. At that period also, HTML5 was announced, another small game changer. I read something in my mad dash around the interweb that HTML5 was introduced to stop Flash. The other thing that stopped Flash was that Apple wouldn't support it. Or Silverlight. So kind of new, you know, my current boss, just as a side story, around this time wrote a book called Integrating Silverlight with Azure. And I was a technical reviewer. Literally 2 days before it came out, Microsoft announced that they were no longer going to support Silverlight. Yeah, he didn't get much royalties on that one. Unfortunate. 2016 to 220, we are much closer to where we are now. We're seeing improvements in native HTML. The HTML5 stuff's coming in. We have a better sense of what it's doing. We are seeing browser APIs improving, giving us more functionality. This is also when we started getting applications, like the React was a bit earlier, we started moving further into spas. So new versions of Angular, React were coming in. We were getting more confident with building these applications. Which brings us to 2021. What year is it? 2022. Oh, I knew I was somewhere near that. Okay, and that's where we are. So that's kind of the history. And all the things that have influenced it, they've all had an effect. Key things that keep coming up in this, of course, have been performance. So when we started having to use web pages and websites and applications on mobile devices, performance becomes an issue. Usability becomes an issue. Things like that. They're reoccurring themes. Okay, so what's the current state of play? So 30 years of the web. Should be pretty mature by now. It's got his comfy slippers on, maybe a pipe, feet up, cocktail. It's looking good. Not really. So I feel like the web world is kind of like a small boy in big trousers. You know, they're constantly running around screaming their heads off. There are good things that have happened. We have seen the death of IE, which was recently announced. Big bonus. I just hope all the hospitals can afford to update their operating system so they also can enjoy that benefit. We're also, brain just stopped working. It will get there. You know, we have seen things like service workers, PWA coming in. The browsers are becoming much more compliant. So one of the biggest issues we had in the past was that, you know, I'm developing on browser X, Chrome, and someone calls up and says, I'm on Firefox and it looks like shit. 3. We have got a place now, especially when Microsoft went and just decided to use the Chromium engine, that we actually can have a reasonably high level of assurance that when we build something that it's going to work pretty well, as long as we've designed it properly in most browsers, with minor exceptions, which means we're not having to worry about vendor prefixing or writing JavaScript that's going to go, if IE, do this, if not, do something else, which was kind of what jQuery sold for us a little bit. But all is not well in the forest. So in my reading, there's been a lot of complaints. People are getting riled up. And one of the key ones is performance. Now, I'm not sure, but one of the suppositions I have is that in 2020, Google had said that their Web Vitals core which measures things like first contentful paint, first time to interaction, will impact on your search, SEO, search experience optimization. And this has caused amazing number of issues for people. People are blogging about this all the time. Admittedly, I could have been on a QAnon site, but I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that this is where it's happening. And so this thing about performance is coming up again. And I find this really interesting because this is always the thing we keep coming up against. When we first started working on SPA applications, it was, well, we want to improve the performance by only loading what we need. But we're 10, 12 years down the track in developing SPA applications. The other aspect of performance, and I'll touch on later, is the developer experience. We're going to make the developer experience faster and faster. It's going to compile before you've even blinked. I'm not sure I'm convinced about that, but that's the way it is. So performance is sort of an umbrella thing, an issue that's cropping up. What do we get from out of that? Single-page applicants are not so shiny. Now, this kind of makes sense, because what's happened over 10 to 12 years, we're making these things more complex. People are adding more JavaScript. The concern that is being expressed is things like, well, you know, if I start my application up, it's got to load all the JavaScript, all the components, irrespective of the bundles or not, and that's taking too long, which, coincidentally, impacts my score, which impacts my SEO rating. Now, these things aren't designed for arm waving. Okay, good. So, one of the thoughts that I came out is because they said, oh, but my website is loading too low and my score and Google search is going to be down. And I'm thinking, why are you writing a website with single-page application? I mean, we're talking marketing sites, maybe a blog site. You know, it might have a cart, who knows? Why are you writing it as a single-page application? But what they've done is, well, all the hip kids are writing single-page applications, so that's what we write. And now I'm going to complain about it. This doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means they're slightly misguided. And this is driving a lot of what the conversations are about, the concept of how long this takes to happen. What's the hydration? Can we do partial hydration? Island hydration, I think that was a term I hit. Very interesting. So that's a big player at the moment. We're also hearing people talking about multi-page applications. To me, that just sounds like a website I wrote in 1996, you know. I kind of get it. It is not quite that, and I think this is the thing. The browsers and the mechanics behind this have improved. Browsers can now, if you load up some CSS and JavaScript in your first page and you have that reference in your second page, it doesn't reload it. It says, hey, yeah, I know, I got that, that's cool. We've got caching that actually works a lot better. So it's not that stupid, but it does feel a little weird. And also, it's what it's putting into question is, and one of the reasons we had SPAs was because, you know, we said client routing is faster. So a lot of what we did, aside from pulling the data, was saying, well, if I load up all these components, we can use client routing, it's not calling back to the server, so we're cool. People are now saying, well, no, now that isn't the fact. Things have changed. So, server-side rendering and friends. So, I'm going to be honest, the first time I saw SSR, and they're saying, well, SSR this, SSR, and I said, what is SSR? Turns out, server-side rendering. We also get SSG, static site generation. These are very exciting. So what you will now see, if you look around, is a lot of articles discussing pros and cons of these things. And as I said, you know, think concepts of hydration. What should we be hydrating? Should we, you know, how can we reduce the amount of JavaScript we're loading? I know React's got server-side, some server-side rendering stuff, and we'll discuss this more when we look at frameworks and libraries. But this one is the big kahuna at the moment. I've just put this up because this amuses me. There's also a zero JavaScript kind of clique. They're like the really weird QAnon people. This is a bit like back in the day, JavaScript was evil. So when we were building web applications, corporations and companies everywhere shut off JavaScript. You can't load JavaScript. You can't have cookies. Cookies are evil as well. This is sort of not quite that. This is the quite slightly lesser evil JavaScript, but there is this idea that says, well, maybe we don't need JavaScript. I mean, there are hypothetical things like WASM. Maybe that's it. I have heard discussions about Rust being a contender for taking over from JavaScript. But I just put this up because I think it would look great on a T-shirt. So anyone wants that, you can have it. Finally, the gradient of the learning curve and the DX developer experience. So on one hand, we've got discussions about performance of the applications. On the other hand, we've got discussion about the performance of our developers. Now, one of the things you say, oh, well, application X or, framework X, it's got a very steep learning curve. Doesn't everything have a steep learning curve? And what are we talking about? You mean you're saying that your people, your developers are stupid? And actually, no, I worked for a company that did think that. They actually hired stupid people so they could control them. Sort of like a cult, but not quite. But this is one of these conversations when we're looking at frameworks and libraries. Oh, what's the learning curve? Oh, this one's got a very smooth learning curve. I want my people to learn. Things are difficult to learn. I've been practicing martial arts for 25 years. I am still learning. This is it. So I always think this is a bit of a furphy. Unless something is so opaque, or in my case, Python, which is my current boîte noire, this is not something, but it's what gets discussed a lot. The other one is the DX experience. This framework, it's one of the ones you're getting now is because ES modules are really kind of mainstream. You're getting frameworks for developers that don't bundle. So you take the build out, that's great. Or, we'll only build what you've changed, good. Don't use Webpack, use Vite. Faster, slower, all of these things. But that's what a lot of conversations, again, it's about the speed. And that's the part that worries me. What are you doing? Running a coal mine and using children in it? I don't think so. Yes, we want to be reactive. We want to be able to respond quickly and stuff. But I remember, when I used to compile code back in the early 90s, I actually enjoyed the fact that I'd go and have a coffee while it did its thing. And I'm not even going to discuss rendering 3D animations. That was a whole night exercise. But that's one of the other ones, and that's some of the sales pitches we get. Good. So, my library is better than your library. This one is, we get this a lot. So, back in the day, like maybe 2 years ago, because time's moving quickly, when we were looking at front-end frameworks, React, Angular, and a side view. Usually it was the React and Angular. And when I was in Redify, that was a common argument. Angular gives you everything. It's a complete framework. It's too regimented. Why does it do that? React, it's a bit like buying a kit car and all you get's the engine. You've got to work out all the other bits you've got to put onto it. So I have freedom with React. Whereas Angular is sort of kind of like, pointy-headed boss. But that was what we were talking about. And then Vue kind of was sitting in there. And it's one you saw when you were driving past in the car. But things are moving on. We're seeing more libraries coming out. So the first one is Svelte. Anyone heard of Svelte? Yeah. Look, I think it's really interesting. It takes a slightly different approach. Because what it's saying, it's not using JSX. Got to point that out. It sits closer. It's more like a subset of HTML. But it compiles it into your JavaScript. And so, again, what are the reasons for this? This gives us a cost benefit. It did it again. And I think I'll put it up here. Thank you. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And I'm not going to spend too long on these. I've done too many to-do lists to really want to bother with it anymore. But it's worth having a look at. I kind of like it. But it's also syntactically, it feels a little strange. The next one, which has also come up on the radar in the last year, is SolidJS. Again, a very interesting one. This is almost like a response to React. It uses JSX, but I think it's TypeScript first. But what they're pushing is the idea of taking out the complexity of React. So as developers struggle with complexity. They've done things like they've reduced the way hooks work. If you're familiar with React, making that simpler. They've modified the way you can write your code. And again, they're looking at ways of, they're using kind of, if you like, primitive reactives so that it's more efficient in processing it. And it doesn't, the big one, it doesn't use a virtual DOM. So unlike React, which keeps a virtual DOM and then has to walk it to find a change and then push it back out, this doesn't use anything like that. I've had a small play with it. It's quite nice. Next one, web components. Anyone who knows me knows I have been a long-time advocate for web components, and it has felt like an uphill fight for a long time as well. But they, again, have come into the mainstream. We now have browsers that can support web components natively. We have libraries like Lit, which makes writing them easier, and we have large organizations who are actually building web component libraries. Microsoft Graph Toolkit is written in web components. GitHub's got web components. IBM's got web components, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there you go. Probably needs a 5.4 floppy disk as well. But I think I'm going to say these need to be looked at. Most of these frameworks, with the exception of React, which still requires a wrapper at this point, will support web components natively. So if you need to build presentation pieces, this is a good way, because the key thing is it's actually part of the specification for W3C. Web components are a specification. They're not something built onto the side. And the last one, I'm just calling this out, this one, Matosis, which I think is an unfortunate name if you come from Australia and know about rabbits. Sounds like Myxomatosis. This one is the most interesting one. It's only in beta, but it's essentially an intermediate language compiler. Not quite, but what it does, it has its own syntax. I think it's kind of based on JSX. Don't quote me, I'm not looking at my notes. But what it does do is that it will take that and compile it into a JSON structure. And from that JSON structure, you can create a component in any library that you want. So currently, on their site, supports React, Angular, Svelte, Swift, web components, straight HTML. So I can build a component, push it through their little serializer, which generates like an intermediate point, which is JSON, and then say, I want Angular components, thanks, and it will actually go and build those out for you. Now, of all of these, I really hope that one succeeds, because it will actually address a lot of the issues we currently have with long-term running projects and stuff like that. So it's worth keeping your eye on that. Okay. The great thing, with the exception of Angular, Angular sort of feels like the kid who came to a formal when everyone else was in fancy dress. Stop that. It's still flashing, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to go. With most libraries, what we end up saying, and React's a classic case. So yeah, React, here it is, completely unopinionated. Do what you want. But then you've got to think about all the other stuff. So what we end up seeing coming about are frameworks which actually allow us to do the rest of the building of the application. So what happens if I change slides. And again, there's a number of these. Some are not so new. Probably the most common one is Next.js if you're doing React stuff. It basically sells itself as a framework for supporting React. But where, again, the key thing is, and across nearly all of these, is that it's saying we can handle server-side rendering for you. We have the smarts to be able to go through your code, work out what we can send up without JavaScript, work out what we need to send some JavaScript with, work out what we can just render on the server, and then send it completed with whatever data you've pulled in, send it to the server. That's its big sell. It has a page-based routing system. So it actually uses files on your router, so you drop your files in, bang, and it routes to them. And then when it needs to do something on the client side, it can do it. Remix is kind of like the young contender. It's come through. I had a note about Remix. So this has been developed by the people behind React Router. It's kind of trying to say, oh, we do it even better than Next.js. We're really cool. They're only sort of cool. There are actually underneath the covers some structural differences about, I think from memory, Next.js is kind of node-based, and Remix is just more of an API-based system. But they do similar things. Again, server-side rendering is managed, partial hydration, removing JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that one. SvelteKit, I'm not going to talk about too much. It's essentially, it is the framework for working with Svelte. So Svelte will allow you to create components. SvelteKit does the rest of it. And again, and it's going to get really boring very soon, server-side rendering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Marco, they actually came out of eBay. That it had been behind eBay's walls. They developed about 213. And they've only just recently made it open source. Key thing about this, it's not a React framework, whereas Remix and Next are. This is not. It actually uses a superset of HTML, which it then extends. It is really, I think, going to be focused more around websites than, say, web applications, but no, it's there. Quick's interesting. It tries to distinguish itself, saying it has the goal of instant applications. So it's going to strip everything out, and your application is going to load immediately. Again, I think it's more of a website-based approach. I haven't had a lot of time with it. I've kind of tested some of the others, but not with that one. And the final one is Astro. So Astro is kind of, it's not like Marco, but I'll say this for a moment. Astro is very much focused towards static websites, from what I can understand. But guess what? You can use it with React, Svelte. Let me just check my list here, because I hate getting this wrong. Oops. Let me go back there. I'm trying to drive the scroll bar. So React, Svelte, Vue, Solid, Alpine, Lit, and vanilla JavaScript. So it says we can work with any of these, and we'll create static websites from it. No, that's fine. Whatever rocks their boat. I'm seriously not going to give it too much time unless suddenly there's a major, transform in the universe. But again, it's worth looking at these to see how they view the problems and how they go about solving them. So I'm not discrediting any of them. I'm just not going to play favors either. So if you go to any of these sites, these are marketing sites. And every single one of them is going to go, we're performant, server-side rendering, great developer experience. We play polkas on Sundays. It's a bit like going to a salad bar and every salad's just tomato and lettuce. There's just 10 of them. They're all tomato and lettuce. What do we do? And what do developers do? And this is the part I need to get to next. My concern is with this cornucopia of choices, developers are going to do probably one of three things. Stick a towel over their head and hope Armageddon shows up soon. Spend all their time reading to-do lists. Not to-do lists come next, but top 10 JavaScript frameworks. I have read 20 of those, and I still didn't have an answer. Or you'll sit there and you go, oh, I'm going to go and do a to-do list. And literally my laptop now is just full of sample to-do lists. And I think one sample blog post. Or worse, you actually get smart enough to say, okay, I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to choose framework Y. And then you're going to spend the rest of your time looking over the fence, because the grass is always greener over there, wondering what you're missing out on. We are in an awkward position. I kind of regret that there's so much going on in this world. But there seems to be this thing that no one can stop reinventing the wheel or trying to build a better mousetrap. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but, and if we're looking at market forces, yes, competition is good. It drives things. But for us, who have got to work with this stuff, making these decisions are difficult. Okay, so where does that leave us? As you can probably guess, my personal opinion on the current state of framework designing is exciting in many ways, but I also think that we're creating for a rudder for our own back. The key one is that we're looking at issues of performance And we're seeing that the only solution is to throw more technology at it. Now, I kind of get that. We're software developers. Everything can be fixed with technology, or a bash script, whatever you want to do. But this worries me. I think, are we possibly going down a path we shouldn't? My key thing is, and part of the kind of where this talk is heading, is we should be thinking about what we're doing. We should be reviewing what we're doing. Over the last couple of years, I picked up I took over responsibility for an application that I actually wrote 10 years ago. Now, it's AngularJS, users require, doesn't have NPM, but funnily enough, it's got some oddities in it. It was really easy to keep working on it because it was well set up and well structured. I also took over another one which had been started in React, and so consequently, for the first time, I actually had to learn React in anger as opposed to kind of, oh, that looks interesting. And there were decisions made in that which I could see were going to cause us problems and would introduce performance issues at some point down the track. So these are some small thoughts. It's going to be reasonably random. Focus on the goal, not the means. Also great for T-shirts. I'll sell it to you if you want. Too often, look, we get excited. Why are you at this conference? Because this stuff excites you. Because you love technology. We're all squirrels. Ooh, shiny thing. You know, this is good. But we have to remember, what are we building and why are we building it? And the decision shouldn't be based on the technology stack you pick, but on what you were trying to get done. Then come back and decide what is the best approach for that technology. I know that takes some of the fun out of it. I'm sorry. But in the end, whoever's using your website or your web application, and just to be clear, I've never built that website. I've done web apps. That's what I do. You know, I build dashboards for health systems, which, you know, critical care, 24/7. I have to worry about how it's going to work for them, and so do you. The user doesn't care whether you wrote it in Notepad, it's built on ASP.NET, or whatever. It doesn't mean anything. It's completely meaningless. Does it do what they need it to do? And we've got to always come back to that, because if we don't, we are being untrue to ourselves and we are making it worse for our end users. Okay, don't believe the hype. So this goes back to my whole marketing pitch. If you are looking at a framework or you're giving it consideration, read the small print. It's really good. Don't just rely, and look, and most of these sites are great. They'll have like a 10-step, 20-step tutorial, take you through the basics. You know, at the end of it, you get a little certificate. No, you don't get a certificate. That's a certification. And it looks great. But what you really need to do is to take it for a good long run. My recommendation is, if you are considering an application, you're saying, hey, this has got some features I really like. This is really cool. I think we could really benefit from this. Do development. Spike out a real-world workflow. One of the things I do is I've got a couple of applications that, again, were written 10 years ago. But what I do is I say, this stuff works. And it has these particular set of problems. So I will then try and recreate it in a different framework or in a different library, because it gives me a baseline to measure it against. So don't just pick it up because it's cool and shiny. Ask yourself, what's the security like? Is it easy to manage authentication and authorization? If you're working in any kind of corporate or business world, you probably want to make sure you can authenticate against AAD, because that's what we tend to do. Push it hard. Find out where the edges are, and then make a decision. If you come away from that and your team comes away and they go, yep, this is going to really work for us, then you look at taking it on. But don't just because it's the new kid on the block, don't take lollies from it. They've probably got hemlock in them or something. The other thing you want to consider is looking at your overall scope. So some of these libraries that I was testing during the time I was researching this, I was doing stuff. I have a thing for a monorepo frameworky thing called NX, which I think is really interesting. I need to do more work on it. But one of the other things I have a big thing for is Storybook. So I really like the idea of Storybook giving us a design system, which is also kind of helps me with testing and verifying what it is. So The trouble with NX is that it defaults to Webpack. That's okay. So I was trying Solid. Now I think Solid defaults to using Vita. Or no, it was even worse. It was NPMP. NPNPM. So yes, there's a new package manager out there. And I can tell you now, don't run the wrong command because you blow everything up. So the point was that Solid will not work with Storybook at this point. Now, if Storybook is an essential part of your development infrastructure and processes, don't take on a library that's just going to cause you hell and mayhem. So, and this is the other problem with, and it goes back to, and we'll cover this, the idea, especially with the JavaScript thing, do you really need that third-party library? One of the other problems I've run into is that, say the primary framework or library I'm using decides it's going to do an update. Now, I know this happened with a library with React when it went to 18, but the library was still only developed against React 17. So again, I either don't upgrade React or I break what that third-party library does. And unfortunately, node modules is just a weird, creepy place where stuff is stored. So if you're looking at assessing these things, also look at what your entire development process is, because it's going to be kind of important if you make that decision and you don't want to break it. Okay. An app is not just for Christmas. I know you think it is, but the other problem I see quite frequently is that, say, oh, we got the 3-month project. Oh, I'm going to use Solid, and I'm going to use this, CSS library and stuff, and it'll work great, and we build it. And then someone else comes along 6 months later and has to work on it, and they look at it and go, I've got no idea. You need to realize that when we build web applications, project may only take 3 months, 6 months, but it will run for 10 or 12 years. As I said, I've got one out there which is used by Ambulance Victoria. It's been going for nearly 12 years, 24/7, non-stop. We do want to update it, but that's getting tricky. So when you build it, when you think about what libraries and stuff you're going to use, even the solution structure that you choose for managing your source code is going to be important. Because what does happen is that if developers don't understand what the application does, they start doing weird stuff. And weird stuff, again, will bring us performance issues. A former client I had, who liked hiring stupid people. Apparently that was actually in the testing they used. They had to meet a stupid marker. They had an ASP.NET application, full framework. That's not the point. But they were using CSS. The problem is they kept bringing developers and saying, oh, we need a new button, or we need to change the color of this, or we've got a new theme. It ended up having 25 style sheets that were getting loaded every time the page went up. And they wondered why it was running slowly. And the worst part of it was really bad CSS, which I'll cover in a second. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we set up everyone who follows us and all the expansions we're going to use for success. I mean, the other one is Visual Studio and .NET. They would have a SPA application, so you could do Angular or React, and they kept sticking it into a web folder. Horrible place for that stuff. And it makes it very hard to work on. So whatever you choose and wherever you go, think about not just now, but think about what's going to happen in 10 years. Because if you're unlucky, that's how long it's going to last. Know your HTML. I bring this up because, again, we keep coming back to performance, and part of the issue with performance is that we badly structure the initial work we do. I am still seeing code now where people put headers inside as a div tag. I put text in the div tag. The div tag is not designed for that. The div is a container. That is all. So know your HTML. Actually understand it. It's a very rich markup language. It provides a lot of functionality. And the other key point, and the one that's coming up now, is the concepts of accessibility. The better you use HTML, the more accessible your pages will be to users who need to rely on screen readers or anything else. It also means that you actually end up not writing too much HTML. So, again, I'll see people kind of nest stuff all the way down. Now, if I'm a screen reader, I'm going to give up halfway because the walk's too long. But, I think you've got to come back. You've got to make sure your team actually understand what this stuff is. And this is and I was not going to have a crack at React, but there you go. It was my problem with React and with JSX is that it's not HTML. So you bring a dev in who doesn't really know HTML, starts working on React, and Sunday you're going to show him HTML, and they're going to try and type in class name. And it's not going to work because it doesn't exist, because you're not actually getting the truth of what is generated. And I see this also with third-party components, especially in the React world. There's one I have a particular hatred for, and I saw, I wonder what the hell is this doing? And it literally was divs from here till tomorrow for a text box. Can't work that one out. So know your HTML. Okay. The developer, the component, and CSS. So I wasn't going to put this one in, but I couldn't help myself. Bootstrap. We all know what Bootstrap is. We all curse Bootstrap. I think it's actually having a revival now. I think it's come in from the dark. But Bootstrap really solved a lot of problems for us because developers are inherently visually challenged, I've decided. So they need all the help they can get. They're also not very good with CSS. And if I ever see a font size defined in pixels again, I'll spit. But that's another story. But Bootstrap actually solved a lot of problems for a lot of people. It provided a grid layout, which was really useful. You had a lot more, you could modify the colors. It went to Sass. And that was kind of good. And then we had other ones, more component libraries. And, so manual design. I've just gone blank. Material design. So again, we've defined some parameters. Kind of sexy, you can have 2 colors. That was kind of weird. And then we get further and further down into the component library territory. Need a calendar selector. So you spend all your time looking at different libraries. And problem is if we suddenly say, oh, well, I've got this library, I better bring it in, and I'm going to bring 20 other things in with it. Again, let's get back to performance. We're not being selective or say, well, I'm going to take this library in. Because all I wanted was a calendar selector, which you actually technically don't need. So my thing is components are good, and they do solve some stuff for us. But I would then also say question whether you always need them. Again, if we look at where we are with the state of HTML, a lot of the stuff that we used to need components for, we don't need it anymore. Except around some styling things, but even that's changing. So, and again, this is the thing, this React component library that I had the misfortune of inheriting is one of the worst written things I've ever seen. I've actually gone into their source code, and I'm scared. But because it looked really good and shiny on the top. So if you're going to use components, review them. Actually put them in a page, look at the HTML they're generating. Make sure it's HTML you could live with, and that someone's not going to pull up when you do a job interview saying, did you write that? Because they will, along with the selfies on Facebook. So, just got to be careful with them as well. CSS is the thing we should be doing. As developers, we need to be better with CSS. Like HTML, understand it. It is a basic building block. It is incredibly powerful, and it's more powerful, every couple of years. They're bringing changes in. Yes, there are libraries that help you. I'm a big fan of Tailwind CSS, and I've been working with that for quite a while. But don't always go to a component. Maybe work out what you can do in CSS. But if you're going to use CSS, use it prudently. Don't just keep adding custom classes all the way through it. CSS now, we used to use Sass a lot because it allowed us to define variables, and then it would kind of, Babel would do its thing on it, and we've got that. But we've got variables in CSS. We can actually nest stuff in CSS. So they're a bit like my HTML statement. Review what you're doing, and don't use pixels for font sizes. Key takeaway. How are we going for time? Rocking it. Review your assumptions and be willing to change. So this goes back again, and one of the things I was coming across a lot, and this is very specifically the SPA applications, is that we built things based on assumptions that we might have had 3 years ago. So well, I'm trying to think of an example. Calendar controls, good one. You know, that's actually native now. There's a lot of things, making AJAX calls. You know, fetch exists as an API. We didn't need a library to do that anymore. Don't keep doing the same thing just because that's the way you have always done it. You need to stop and go, okay, I should actually see if there is other ways of doing this. Is there something better? But because we're face down in our keyboards, we tend to lose sight of what's going on. So you do need to review what your assumptions are about the stuff you're implementing. You know, do I really need it? You know, do I actually need that 300-line JavaScript? Maybe not. And be willing to change. The other thing that I have come across quite often is that, and if we go back to picking frameworks and whatever else, you know, well, you know, we've made this decision, and then for the next 6 months, they've got a round peg and a square hole and a very large hammer. You have to be willing to say, oops, we made a mistake. This is not, you know, we can't always tell, but you're going to hit some point and say, this cannot do what we want to do unless we do some really weird stuff here. So I think the willingness to change. Now, I know this is really not easy. If you're working for a company or a client, and there's time pressures and stuff, but then I would argue we need to build in that ability to change into our engagement with our bosses, with our teams, with whoever. Because if we do not practice adaptation and change, we end up with something we're going to regret. And we'll get back to that, well, it's not performing really well because we ended up using this library and we built this JavaScript, but it wasn't appropriate, but we can't change it. Change is good, pragmatically, and you need to change as well. Okay, use the platform. I've kind of been covering this in a kind of weird, sort of roundabout way. Back in the days of Polymer, anyone knew what Polymer was? You are an older audience than I thought. This is good. Polymer was a thing Google was promoting, and it was like that really early attempt to get web components into the mainstream. The problem is that they were actually like 4 years ahead of themselves, so a lot of the work had to be polyfilled and stuff. ING Bank, and this is where I first ran into it when I was working in Madrid, are big on Polymer, and they're now big in web components. So there's another large organization using web components. And they had this, you know, spiffy hashtag, use the platform. It actually sounded like some weird religious cult, actually. And, you know, you see videos and they're all smiley and use the platform. This is not what I'm talking about. Use the platform. Again, you know, we're seeing all this mayhem over here, but things like browsers and the web APIs are on a constant growth path. They're steadily just going along, doing stuff. So use the platform is saying, if I can use an API, a web API in the browser, I don't need to build this weird custom code. You know, fetch API is a very obvious one. That changed how we thought about making AJAX calls. It simplified it. There's an API that's in beta that's actually going to help doing page transitions. And literally, it has 2 tags, and it takes a snapshot of the screen, holds onto it while you go to the next page, and then does a merge and across. It's seriously in beta, but it's cool. Now, we have to write that stuff now. So always come back to, what can I use that's already there in the browser? What functionality can I make useful to me? And why do we want to do this? Because if we go back to the final point, the earlier point, performance, I can probably reduce the JavaScript I have to write, which means I'm going to reduce the JavaScript that I'm going to actually have to push up to the browser. And this goes back to reviewing your assumptions. Don't always assume that you've written something one way, that there isn't a better way of doing it now. Oh, I'm doing good today. Okay, so in summary, there is no silver bullet. Though I think we always live in hope of one as long as it doesn't hit us. There's a lot happening, and there's a lot more coming around the corner. This is, you know, there is things going on. And it'll be interesting to see what sticks and what fails. And this is always the tricky part, because at some point you've got to back some horse. My personal opinion at the moment is have a look at some of the newer libraries and stuff, but maybe stick with what's working well for you. Because, and as an example, I was looking up Snowpack, which is another bundler stuff, and I had been looking and thinking of using it, and I went on the website to look something up, and they've stopped supporting it since 2020. Or something like that, you know. So, you know, some of this stuff is looking really cool, but is it going to have longevity? It just goes back to saying your application is going to live longer than the 3 months that your project runs. So we've got to take that into account. My main concern is that the hurly-burly, whether we're seeing, we can lose sight of what is important, which is building applications for people to use. And I will always come back to this. People, your end users, are the ones that are going to matter in the end. Whether it's a marketing website, which I quite honestly can't get excited about, or an application that's going to be used in an office, it's going to be used in a hospital, it's going to be on the phone, it's going to be on a desktop, it's going to be on giant monitors. The people who are using your applications are the ones that matter. And so we should always focus back at that point. This stuff I've talked about, they're our toolkit. You know, I'm the carpenter, this is the toolkit I carry. But if I'm building a house, all we really need to know is not what is the house made of, but is the house fit for purpose? That's where we should be going with this stuff. And that's it. I ranted, and I think I only swore twice, 4 times. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've got 2 minutes. Has anyone actually got any questions? Yes, at the back.
What's your take on these new hybrid technologies such as Flutter and now the new Microsoft Maui that's coming out?
Oh, look. Look, I think they're interesting. The number of times I have seen the build once, run everywhere has been long, and it goes way back to Java. So I remember the first time I was at the university, they built a Java application, rolled it out as a piece of shit. I'm going to put it simply, 6. I think they're interesting, and I think this is the point about checking your assumptions. Always go back, give it a run, but if it's going to block you, then maybe you want to pull back. And like I said, mitosis interests me because it actually provides maybe a third path, given that, especially in organizations, you may have applications built across multiple frameworks and libraries. Any other questions? Good. As again, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure.